I watched the last of the Von Erich special from Viceland, and I'd say it was the second best one so far after the Bruiser Brody one. The Gino Hernandez one airs this week. I've already seen that one. I'd put that one third behind these two. Mula is the last one. I haven't watched that one yet, but I have access to it from a friend, so I'll probably watch it this week. They've all been good, and the ratings for each one have increased with each airing, which hopefully bodes well for a second season. One of the directors said that they've already shot about 75% of a seventh episode on the death of Dino Bravo, which would be a fascinating watch. I've talked about Bravo's death before on the podcast, but to see it play out on the screen or maybe even have some additional details added to what may or may not have happened, I think would be a must watch. He also said they want to do episodes, if they do come back for a second season, on Adrian Adonis's death in that van accident. Actually, three wrestlers died, not just Adonis, in that car accident. He was one of them. They want to do one on Chris Benoit, which you can understand why. And they want to do one on the Brawl for All that WWE did back in 1998, which I guess could be interesting. I can't say that excites me too much. But anyway, hopefully it bodes well for a second season. I had some people ask me, what did you think about this as compared to the Heroes of Wrestling? If I watch this one, am I going to learn anything new that I didn't already know from that documentary? I'm ashamed to say that I never watched the Heroes of World Class documentary, but shout out to Adam for hooking me up with a copy. I do plan to watch it soon. So I can't say that there is much in this special that you would not already know. I mean, Heroes of Wrestling, I think, is like a 2-hour documentary or more. This is not even an hour. I'm almost sure you're not going to learn much in the way of new information watching this, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't watch and that it isn't worth your time, because I think it is. It does focus on Kevin Von Erich, even more so than just it being a general Von Erich documentary. Kevin as the survivor, obviously. I mean, Kevin is heavily focused on here as the lone surviving member of the Von Erich men. He has two sons of his own now who wrestled at one of the Impact Slammiversary shows maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was a one-shot because they were in Texas. They were looking for some kind of a draw. They thought, well, we're in Texas, and so why not go to the Von Erichs, who were a draw so many years ago? And I remember Kevin even put the claw on somebody during that match. These days, he's living in Hawaii. I was on his Twitter. I was looking at some of the photos that he posts of the creatures down there that he finds, little geckos and lizards and all sorts of just life and creatures, the lakes, the waterfalls. It reminds me of when I was in Costa Rica. I'm jealous. I mean, it is beautiful. The property he owns there, and him sitting up in the tree drinking pineapple juice, and the backdrop behind him. It's like paradise. And he seems to be enjoying his life. He's in a good place. But you watch this, and what this guy has been through, all of the loss, all of the tragedy that he has been through, it's a miracle that, he didn't end up in a bad place himself. A lot of people would crack. A lot of people, might just succumb to depression and horrible thoughts. And there was all this talk for years of the Von Erich curse. And Kevin Von Erich, at least, is someone who you could say, if there was a curse, broke the Von Erich curse, because he's in a good place now in his life. And they talked about, how massively, insanely popular the Von Erichs were in Dallas back when World Class was hot. During that early to mid-'80s period, there was no territory in the country, or maybe even the world, hotter than World Class Championship Wrestling. Fritz Von Erich. Fritz was a big name in the NWA as a wrestler, and in World Class, where he obviously took over and was running the promotion later on when he was retired or semi-retired. He had 6 sons, 5 of whom lived long enough, Fritz did, to bury before he himself died of cancer. I think it was lung cancer in 1997. I think it might have been lung cancer that traveled to his brain. So he passed away in 97, and the documentary takes us through each of the Von Erich deaths, the highs of when the Von Erichs were popular, and then each of their deaths. The first one being Jack Jr. He was the youngest. He was only 6 years old when he died, he was electrocuted and fell face down and drowned in a puddle outside. David, he died in a hotel room in Japan from what was said to be, and what Kevin insists in the documentary, was acute enteritis, or he called it gastroenteritis. Now, the story over the years has changed a bit. They've claimed that it was a kick during a match in Japan that ruptured his intestine, which is a lie, because he died before he even wrestled his first match on that tour. So that couldn't have been true. Now, on this special, Kevin just says David was throwing up right before he left for his trip, but his father insisted that he go, and he makes the trip, and so he went and flew to Japan. But he claims he was already sick before he left. Now, I know that Ric Flair and a lot of other wrestlers from that period, Flair is hardly the only one, are convinced that that was just a cover story for a drug overdose. I know Dave Meltzer years ago, and Meltzer actually lived in Texas. He was, I think, actually living in Texas during that period when World Class was so hot. He did a big write-up on the Von Erichs years ago, right after Kerry died. So this would have been sometime in 93. So we're talking 25 plus years. He did this huge feature on the Von Erich family. He noted in The Observer that David was out at Ribera Steakhouse the night before he passed away. He was doing a lot of drinking. And the next day, when he didn't come down to the lobby, one of the Japanese referees went to David's hotel room with Bruiser Brody. They may have even knocked down the door, and they found him dead. And it was Brody who flushed the drugs that they found down the toilet. So nobody would know about them, nobody would see them, nobody would suspect. And it was allegedly the same drug that his brother Mike Von Erich, later overdosed on, this drug Placidol, which was a sleep medication of some kind. I think they used it to treat insomnia in some people. They don't even manufacture them anymore. They stopped in the late 90s in part because so many people were abusing them, and I guess they just came out with better, more effective drugs. So they don't even make that anymore. I mean, look, we had a Supreme Court justice who was addicted to them. So this was a big problem back then. Now, Kevin, in the documentary, he insists it was gastroenteritis, and he acknowledged people thought it was drugs. He said it was gastroenteritis, and we couldn't save him. And I get why he would want to stick to that story. But I believe it was probably a drug overdose. Nobody will know for sure. Nobody could ever know for sure. I believe there was a reporter, and I forgot his name, something Mushnick. I don't know if it was Irwin or Irv Mushnick, who many, many years ago, I believe, was asking about this, and the family had said they would provide him with either like a death certificate or an autopsy report just to kind of set the record straight once and for all. And then right before they were going to give it to him, they reneged and they never gave it to him. The whole thing sounds to me like they're covering up for what was probably a drug overdose, because that just doesn't sound as glamorous. So they came up with this other story, and it would not be the first time that Fritz or the family would come up with some kind of story or excuse. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't, to explain away something bad. And that's what I think probably happened in this instance. So Jack dies, then David dies. Kerry then wins the NWA World title from Ric Flair, only to drop it not even 3 weeks later, because he had his own issues, and he was said to be very unreliable because of those issues. They never planned on keeping the title on him for very long. It was more, David died, and it was this big event kind of in his honor, and they wanted to give Kerry and the family the big moment of him winning the championship, and he got it, and then they got that freaking belt off him as quickly as they could right after. After David's death, they talked about how Fritz pushed for a new Von Erich brother to be added on TV, Lance Von Erich. Now, Lance Von Erich, the person they had play the role, had no relation whatsoever to the Von Erich family. It was all pure storyline, and Kevin was dead set against the idea. He thought it was stupid. He thought the fans weren't going to buy it. It was going to hurt their credibility, and that's exactly what happened. Lance Von Erich was a total fail. And then the person who played Lance had a falling out with Fritz and jumped to a rival promotion And Fritz, out of spite, went on TV and totally just killed kayfabe and revealed that Lance was not a real Von Erich. It was whatever, part of the story. It was faked or whatever, just to get back at the guy. So Mike was next. Mike Von Erich, he never wanted to be a wrestler. He was not a particularly great athlete, but his father forced him into it after David's death, or pushed him into it. And he just wasn't built for it. He was too small. He took drugs to get bigger. He ended up suffering toxic shock syndrome, and he almost died. He recovered, kind of, but you could tell he wasn't quite right after that. He had no business getting back into the ring, but they put him into the ring anyway. And it was just a downward spiral. It was very sad to hear, again, you hear about his story. It was a downward spiral for him after that. He would get in trouble with the law. It was almost like you hear about people sometimes who they suffer some kind of a traumatic health episode. Maybe they have a stroke. Maybe it affects their brain in some way. They have some kind of traumatic brain injury. You might hear this with soldiers and people who come back from war zones who have suffered some kind of traumatic brain injury, and it changes their behavior. You know, it changes their personality. Maybe they're more aggressive, or they're more withdrawn, or whatever the case may be. It almost sounds as though that may have been the case with Mike Von Erich, where he just wasn't the same person after he recovered from the whole toxic shock episode, got in trouble with the law, and killed himself by overdosing on Placidol. And that was reported in the news media at the time. That was the drug that he OD'd on. And he left 2 suicide notes, one in his car and one in his home. Just 23 years old when he died. David was, I think, 25. Mike was only 23. Then came Chris. Chris committed suicide. He badly wanted to be a wrestler like his brothers. He looked up to Kerry in particular. He loved wrestling. He just wasn't cut out for it physically. He wasn't even allowed to play sports in school because he suffered from asthma. But Fritz, again, sort of pushed him into it. He created all of these phony amateur wrestling accomplishments to help build him up on TV and, you know, in the local media. And when he finally realized that this just wasn't going to work and he was not going to be able to be a wrestler, he shot himself in the head with a 9mm. Just 21 years old. So 25, 23, 21. And if that isn't depressing enough, then you get into the story of Kerry. Now, Kerry was older. I think he was about 30 when he died, but Kerry committed suicide, another suicide. In 1993, he had the motorcycle accident, which they did talk about years earlier. He lost his foot. Apparently, he was riding his motorcycle. He was way over the speed limit, wasn't even wearing any shoes, and rammed into the back of a police cruiser. His foot and ankle were all mangled. He had surgery. They kept it a secret. I don't think his foot was amputated in surgery right after the accident. I think what happened is he had surgery. He was recovering, but the ankle did not, fuse properly, or just the recovery with the ankle was not working. It did not go well. And there was a follow-up procedure, and that's where they had to amputate the foot. And they kept it a secret. Some people knew. There was the story about the match he was in once, and his boot came off, and the people who saw it were just stunned into silence by what they saw. Wrestlers in the locker room would talk about how when Kerry would shower, he would always keep his boot on. That's going to make people think that something's up. So there were people who either suspected, people who flat out knew. Most people did not. If it was the age of today with the internet and social media, the moment that his boot popped off at that indie show, it would have been all over Twitter. But back then, you could kind of keep things under wraps a lot easier than you can today. So a lot of people did not know. WWE knew. Vince McMahon knew long before they signed him to bring him in. There's stories about them playing games with World Class and calling athletic commissions to try to get certain shows shut down and telling them that performer, shouldn't be allowed to perform if they're missing limbs and all this ridiculous stuff that went on in wrestling back then. But they didn't have any issue signing him in 1990, and they brought him in as the Texas Tornado, and he even had a very brief run with the Intercontinental title for a few months. But after that, he didn't do anything. They cut him loose in the summer of 92 because they just didn't want to have any part of him. He had drug problems, he had all sorts of problems, and they just said, you know what? We do not want to have anything to do with this, and they let him go. And he had big-time drug problems to the point where he was probably going to go to jail. He had gotten busted. This was late 92, I think early 93. He got busted, and it looked like this time he was going to jail. And he did not want to go to jail. He knew it. He knew that's probably where he was headed. That's when he drove to his father's ranch, grabbed the gun, went off into the woods, and he shot himself in the chest. And then there's Kevin, the sole survivor. If this were a Survivor Series match, he would be the last brother standing. And after Kerry died, Kevin had this quote where he said, "I've always been the older brother, and now I'm not even a brother." If that isn't the saddest thing that you will hear all day, well, you must be having a really bad day, because that's pretty damn sad. And yet, when the special is over, it was kind of a happy ending, because you see Kevin and his kids and where he's living. I think he's got grandkids now. And the guy has gotten on with his life and seems to be loving life. And so it does end on a happy note. It's not all just sadness and tragedy. Kevin is obviously all over this documentary with, the interview they did with him. They interviewed David Manning, who is a referee in World Class Championship Wrestling. Jim Cornette is interviewed. Dave Meltzer, whose office is just a total fire hazard. You should watch this alone just to get the shot of Meltzer sitting in his office with just paper strewn all over the place. So if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to do so. Even if you don't learn anything new about the story, you can go to the Viceland website and watch the full episode there. If you live outside the U.S., it may be region locked. If so, I don't know what to tell you. But I know here at least you can watch each episode on their website the day after it airs on TV.